Chapter 17, Section 3. New technologies change the way the wars fought. World War I proved to be unlike previous wars in many ways. For example, for centuries, opposing forces had conducted combat face-to-face and hand-to-hand. During the American Civil War, combatants, those physically fighting the war, had faced off against their enemies with handguns or rifles, supported by cannons. Troops fired only at targets they could see clearly. New technology made World War I a more impersonal war, as well as a far deadlier one. Combatants introduced more effective killing machines. Weapons such as a machine gun, an improved flamethrower, and large cannons known as howitzers changed how and where war was fought. Unlike rifles and pistols, the machine gun was a rapid-firing weapon, the first truly automatic gun. A soldier using a machine gun, which sped out 600 bullets per minute, did not have to stop as often to reload. In time, military commanders realized that machine guns could make a greater effect when grouped together. In fact, the Germans created separate machine gun companies to support the infantry. The invention of the machine gun had a major impact on military strategy. Armies accustomed to taking the offensive and attacking head-on were now at a disadvantage. A group of well-placed machine gunners could stop the advance of a much larger force. German forces learned this lesson quickly, but the British and French did not. Allied armies charged across open fields and toward enemy lines, only to be mowed down by machine gun fire, leading to thousands of casualties. In September 1915, British infantry units, each comprising about 10,000 men, charged a well-protected German position. In 4 hours, more than 8,000 men were killed, almost all by machine gun fire. At first, machine guns were used mostly for defense because soldiers found them too heavy and bulky to carry in an offensive attack. Over time, both sides found ways to mount these weapons on aircraft and to use them on warships. Unlike the machine gun, the flamethrower was an old weapon. In the days of the Roman Empire, soldiers would hurl these tubes filled with burning fuel at one another. During World War I, Germany developed a small, lightweight flamethrower that a single person could carry. It sprayed burning fuel on the victims. This weapon was effective in attacks on nearby trenches, but could not be fired long distances. For long-range bombings, both sides used large, heavy artillery, or big guns. Before firing these weapons, gunners loaded them with shells that often contained dozens of small lead balls. Soldiers also used big guns to deliver poison gas. A new type of loading, firing, and recoil mechanism made these guns very useful. Gunners used them to blast through barbed wire, knock out any machine gun nests, and lob poison gas shells at enemy trenches. The best known of these powerful guns were Germany's Big Berthas. Each weighed about 75 tons and could fire 2,100-pound shell a distance of more than 9 miles. Big Berthas were the largest mobile guns ever used on a battlefield. At the beginning of the war, Big Berthas helped Germany sweep through Belgium on its drive toward France. Unable to withstand the assault of these guns, concrete Belgian forts crumbled. In total, heavy artillery inflicted more than half of all battle casualties in World War I. Despite such technological advances, the rifle remained the most widely used weapon on the battlefield. Soldiers found rifles to be lighter and easier to carry than bigger guns when advancing toward the enemy. Soldiers with good aim trained to be sharpshooters, who were specialists at hitting an exact target, or snipers who fire from a concealed position. Both played a key role in a new type of combat called trench warfare. Both armies seek safety in trenches. The introduction of new weapons such as rapid-firing machine guns and powerful long-range big guns made the old style of ground attack far too dangerous. Soldiers could no longer charge each other across an open field. If they did, they could be killed instantly. Instead, both sides dug trenches in the grounds for protection. The result was a new kind of defensive war known as trench warfare. Each side dug multiple lines of trenches, often in zigzag patterns, to make it hard for an enemy's sharpshooters to hit soldiers. Closest to the enemy's trenches lay the front-line trenches. From opposing front-line trenches, soldiers hurled grenades and fired machine guns at one another. Behind the front-line trenches, soldiers dug a line of supply trenches. These held ammunition, other supplies, and communication equipment. In a third line of reserve trenches, weary soldiers rested before returning to the front lines. In the course of trench duty, soldiers rotated to the front line, supply, and reserve trenches. Large barriers of barbed wire circled each side's front lines and extended into the open area between the opposing trenches. This area, called no man's land, was typically about 250 yards wide, but crossing its short distance was usually lethal. Soldiers venturing into no man's land risked being shot or blown up. In this treeless space, any moving object was an easy target for sharpshooters and machine gunners. Water-filled craters made by bombs and artillery shells soon speckled no man's land. Because neither side could find a way to get its troops safely across no man's land, the war ground to a stalemate. Conditions in the trenches were horrible. The muddy trenches smelled of rotting bodies, sweat, and overflowing latrines. Soldiers often caught fevers or suffered from painful foot infections called trench foot, which resulted from standing in the mud and cold water that pooled in the bottom of the trenches. In addition, lice, frogs, and rats surrounded the men. An Allied soldier recalled, "One got used to many things, but I never overcame my horror of the rats. They abounded in some parts, great loathsome beasts gorged with flesh. About the same time every night the dugout was invaded by swarms of rats. They gnawed holes in our haversacks, backpacks, and devoured our rations." Harold Saunders, quoted in Every Man at War, 1930. One of the most terrifying threats soldiers faced was the use of chemical weapons, which utilized toxic agents such as poison gas to kill or harm many people. Germany was the first to use poison gas in World War I. In time, the British and French did as well. The deadliest chemical used was odorless mustard gas. This caused huge, painful blisters, blindness, and lethal damage to the lungs. Those who survived a mustard gas attack often had lifelong injuries. Early on, soldiers simply released mustard gas from cylinders and relied on the wind to carry it across no man's land to the enemy. However, shifting winds often blew the gas back on the sender's trenches. Both sides eventually found ways to put poison gas into shells they fired at each other. In time, both sides developed gas masks to protect their troops from these attacks. Another new weapon, the tank, finally helped end the stalemate in the trenches. Soldiers could drive tanks over barbed wire and crush the otherwise treacherous material. They could also steer the tanks up steep embankments and across ditches to attack enemy trenches. Unsure of how effective this weapon would be, Germany was slow to develop a tank of its own. The Allies were more proactive with their use of this new technology. During the final Allied advance in the summer of 1918, tanks rolled across no man's land ahead of Allied troops, protecting them from enemy gunfire and weakening enemy defenses. The sky is a new battlefield. Improvements to airplanes brought war into the sky. The top speed for early airplanes was about 40 miles per hour, but by 1917, powerful motors allowed airplanes to travel more than 3 times that fast. Planes also became easier to fly and could travel farther than ever before. From the start of the war, both sides used airplanes to scout enemy territory, but the war challenged inventors to create airplanes for more specialized uses, such as fighting and bombing. At first, pilots would lean out of their cockpits and shoot at enemy pilots with a pistol or drop bombs by hand over the side of the plane. Then Dutch inventor Anthony Fokker, working for Germany, built a device that timed the firing of a machine gun with the rotation of a plane's propeller. This allowed a pilot to safely fire a machine gun mounted on the front of his aircraft. Fokker's invention made in-air combat a serious new threat. The Germans also created high-flying, gas-filled airships called Zeppelins. These cigar-shaped aircraft were first used for scouting enemy positions. In 1915, German pilots used Zeppelins in bombing raids over London. Although the German airships terrified British civilians and alarmed the Allies, they often missed their targets. By 1916, the British had found a way to counter the airship threat. They built fighter planes that could fly as high as a Zeppelin and developed bullets sharp enough to pierce the airship's outer skin, causing it to explode. The various roles of the airplane in World War I showed its usefulness and versatility. Indeed, it would play an even greater role in the later conflicts. Waging a savage war at sea. When World War I started, most naval experts had already predicted that the greatest sea battles would take place between heavily armed and armored battleships. In 1906, Britain had introduced the world's first modern battleship, the HMS Dreadnought. It was larger, more powerfully armed, and more heavily armored than earlier warships. Faced with this threat, the major naval powers had scrapped their old fleets and began replacing them with similar battleships. In 1916, the Germans and British navies fought a major naval battle with their battleships. Each side sank many ships, but neither side won a clear victory. After the battle, Germany changed its approach to naval warfare. Its new strategy resulted from Germany's development of armed submarines, or U-boats. Moving silently under the sea, U-boats went undetected until it was too late to stop the torpedoes from reaching their targets. In the first 4 months of 1917, German U-boats sank more than 1,000 ships carrying supplies and weapons to Allied ports. British Admiral John Jellicoe warned, "It is impossible to go on with the war if losses like this continue." The effectiveness of U-boat attacks was greatly reduced by the development of the convoy system. Under this system, Allied warships protected merchant ships by escorting groups of them across the Atlantic Ocean. The number of Allied shipping losses quickly decreased. From April 1917 to November of that year, the material lost to U-boat attacks dropped from about 850,000 tons to just over 200,000 tons. In 1918, the Allies further reduced the submarine menace by laying an underwater barrier of mines across the North Sea and the English Channel.